Hi everyone, this is Sarah, and whether you want to become a coach or whether you just want to get to know yourself better and the workings of your mind, you are going to be interested in NLP training. Now, I build all of my training, whether that's corporate training, NLP and timeline therapy training, or whether it's my Farcical Life program, on the principles of acceptance, integration and alignment. And I thought I would take this opportunity to explain to you why I do that. So, let's talk about acceptance. The concept of, or the idea of I am where I am and I don't know what I don't know, actually engenders curiosity. So, acceptance is effectively the illusion smasher. What's more, when we think about life as it is what it is, it actually stops the fight. It stops us questioning why things are happening to me and why are things this way and why does it have to be this way. If we say it is what it is, then it puts us in a place of actual reality. It puts us in the present moment and it allows us to come up with a cunning plan. What's more, polarity is just a perspective, and acceptance allows us to notice this. What I mean specifically is that let's take the concepts of good and bad. So good and bad exist if we believe they do, and they are the polar opposite of one another. However, if we look at good and bad as 2 points on the circumference of a circle, there are many other points in between good and bad and good as the circle flows. So, the existence of something as either good or something as either bad is just the polar perspective. And when we expand to see the full sphere, we know that there are many more choices in the way that we could choose to label an idea. So, what else? Yes, comparison. Comparison with other people is pointless or futile. The only person it is worth comparing ourselves with is the us of yesterday, the us of the last time we did this. Otherwise, it's a bit like comparing apples and pears or apples and oranges, and there is just no way to compare it. There are too many variables. It's also really useful from the perspective of acceptance to realise that there's no right way and there's no best way. There is just a multitude of different ways that we can achieve the outcome. This is really useful because it moves us towards the concept of choice, and it also minimises judgment, which is what I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So knowing that there is always a choice is really, really empowering, because often we feel as if we are stuck between a rock and a hard place and, there is no choice. And yet, when we expand our perspective and when we operate from acceptance in the now, often we see other choices that we couldn't see before. We expand our viewpoint. Another really beautiful thing that acceptance allows into our awareness is the idea that everyone is equally powerful. We live in a categorized world. We live in a world where, it's a natural process because we're bombarded with so much information. Just like a library, our brains need to put all that information in aisles and then put it in a specific order so that we can retrieve it if we want to later on. However, when it comes to emotional experiences and other ideas, this categorization leads us to draw interesting conclusions such as somebody is better than me, or I am better than somebody else, or this idea of lesser or greater or other polar opposites. And this can be really, really unhelpful because if we see somebody as more powerful than we are, we follow that with the idea that somebody's more perhaps capable than we are, or that somebody's power is the reason that we're unable to do something. It's a bit of a mirage. And in the same way, if we think that somebody is less powerful than we are, We may just be serving one of our own needs to take responsibility or control or ownership of something that has perhaps nothing to do with us. So when we are able to acknowledge that everyone is equally powerful in the acceptance state, we actually free ourselves to some unhelpful attachments. So I've talked a lot about categorization, and the less I categorize, the less I judge. Let's say, for example, we're talking about a work concept, and let's say that we label somebody, maybe even in the recruitment process, as a fast-track prospect. So the moment we label somebody or we categorize that person, we develop expectations of their behavior, and expectations can be misleading and unhelpful. They lead to judgment or a compare and contrast situation. They didn't live up to my expectations, or they exceeded my expectations. Either way, categorization from this perspective is limiting, and the less we categorize, the less we judge. And the less we judge, the more opportunity we have to broaden our perspective. And the broader our perspective, the more successful we are, because we can see more opportunities. Acceptance also cultivates present. It requires a deep honesty of who we are and where we are. And this brings us beautifully into the now moment. And when we're in the now moment, we get the opportunity to express gratitude for what we have right now. And the more we are able to express gratitude for what we have right now, the more we can attract the wonderful things that we have right now, and we can magnify those to grow. And finally, acceptance gives the shadow room to breathe. Now, what do I mean by this? We all have a shadow self. There is no escaping it. And even though, whether through myth or religion or some other educational teaching, we may have been taught that we can operate only on the side of good or righteous or whatever it might be, this is somewhat misleading, and only viewing life from this perspective can actually be quite destructive because it restricts our shadow. And as we know, anyone who works in the therapy or coaching or psychological field, restriction can create some interesting behavior. So we actually always want to move towards expansion rather than restriction. So let's consider the concept of, the hero archetype, for example. If we operate a hero archetype, in our shadow lurks the villain. And if the hero is present, then the villain is present, and it is what it is. So unless we accept our villain, our inner villain, and unless we give our inner villain room to breathe, it doesn't mean to say we act on it, but unless we give it room to breathe, we will find that we become a victim of the inner villain, rather than being able to use the inner villain to drive us forward to create what we want in our world. So, let's talk about integration. We all create parts, and from a psychological perspective, a part is something that is separate from the greater whole. A part is always created for positive intention and often protection. And a part might be labelled as a limiting decision or a limiting belief we have about ourselves, such as I'm not good enough. Or it might be an idea about danger. It may well be a negative emotion that we're choosing to hold on to. And it may well be a value which we hold very dear to our hearts, and yet it is directioned towards the focus of what we don't want rather than the focus of what we do want. All of these are parts, and they are separate from the greater whole. And the only way to actually integrate parts is to expand our perspective. And it's interesting because I too have used misleading terminology in the past because we talk about emotional release and we talk about letting go of ideas and letting go of negative emotions. Actually, I realise this is a somewhat unhelpful way to describe it because we don't really release. What happens is we integrate an individual experience into the greater experience. When we expand our perspective, we actually allow, let's say we have a single sadness event and it's dominant in our focus. When we expand our perspective to focus on more than that single event, we actually get to take in the experience of our entire life. And what that allows us to do is to put into perspective that single sadness experience. So it allows us to realize that we have many more experiences in our life that do not contain sadness. And as a result, it just integrates as part of the greater whole. So as I mentioned, we have to expand perspective. We have to expand the focus in order to achieve that integration. And effectively, what we're doing when we integrate is we are accessing new dimensions of consciousness. And if you want to know more about this, because in my personal opinion, coaching really is the facilitation of mindset expansion into new conscious dimensions. I've written an article about this and I'll drop it into the chat box below so that you can read it. Perspective also helps us expand to achieve our intentions and our goals and our desires, because it allows us to take the higher perspective and see how things can happen and see that there's multiple ways for us to achieve a single outcome. What's more, when we integrate, it requires acceptance. And as we mentioned, or we talked about a moment ago, or even I talked about a moment ago, acceptance allows us to recognize and acknowledge the shadow, giving it room to breathe. So, when we integrate, we get to use the energy of our emotions. And by the way, our thoughts and emotions do actually create physical energy. So, rather than being the victim of our emotions, we get to harness that energy and use it for our own purposes. In the same way, we embrace our shadow and we harness the energy of the shadow and use it for our own purposes. As a result, integration delivers us harmony, it delivers us peace, and the more we integrate, the stronger the platform that we build for further expansion. It is self-sustaining and self-fulfilling. Hurrah to that. Let's talk about alignment. So when I talk about alignment, specifically what I'm talking about is the idea that when our values are aligned with our beliefs, and our beliefs are, as a result, energized by our emotions, we can actually access a state of unhindered progress. It's a bit like finding a road where the hedgerows are just growing all the way into the road. It's really hard to progress. So once we align, we effectively take hedge trimmers to either side of the road and we clear that road so that we can move unhindered. As a result, alignment brings us further clarity. It certainly develops our purpose. It certainly increases our energy and allows us to harness that energy to drive us in the direction we choose. As a result, we can achieve what we want and we can be more flexible because we don't have that defensive standpoint that we may have if we're out of alignment. We can say at any given point in life experience or on a business project, we can say, oh, what if we got this wrong? What if there's a better way to do this? What if we aren't being as efficient as we thought we were? And there's no resistance. There's no kind of rejection of ourselves by asking this question. We're actually just being curious and looking for more opportunities. As a result, alignment delivers us real empowerment. And that real empowerment encompasses ownership, responsibility that is our responsibility rather than somebody else's, and the ability to say, yeah, I take ownership of everything in my world and I can direct my mind. So these are the 3 principles that I build my training on. In addition to that, I thought I would talk about something that I call dosage, because I also think it's fundamentally important, and sometimes we don't talk about it from this perspective. Everything in our world is really all about relationships, and our entire experience of reality stems from the relationship we have with ourselves. And if we nurture ourselves, if we accept ourselves, if we are constantly moving towards integration and alignment, then we are expanding. If we are not following the other principles, then actually, quite possibly, we are limiting ourselves or restricting ourselves in some way. And as we know, restriction creates interesting behavior. Our relationship with ourselves dictates or mirrors the relationship that we have with other people. It also mirrors the relationship that we have with society and family and how tolerant or intolerant we are. What's more, it dictates the relationship we have with ideas, what we believe, what we think we should believe, and the relationship we have with things that we consume or things that we aspire to, like fast cars and big houses and tons of cash. The point is, relationships are really all about attachment and non-attachment, or let's call it degrees of attachment, or as they might call it in mathematics, degrees of freedom. So if we are overly attached to ourselves, then we might find ourselves a bit self-involved. And this is very inward-looking. And if we have no balance of being internally and externally focused, then we're limiting our potential. In the same way, if we're over-focused on others, often we can have a lack of confidence because we wait for other people to tell us that we're doing okay. In the same way, if we have an attachment to how society or family feels about us, then we wait for approval, or we are constantly trying to gain approval. And obviously this it hinders being our authentic selves. Also, ideas. I mean, as we grow, which we are doing constantly, by the way, our relationships with different ideas changes, and the ability to let go, as in to let go of our grip on an idea and expand it into something broader, is really, really important. In the same way, our relationship with things changes. I mean, perhaps in our 20s, we might be really attached to superficial things, whereas actually maybe after having children we become less attached to superficial things. Maybe we don't. It doesn't really matter. There are no rules. The point is, we always want to be aware of our degree of attachment to everything in our world, because that degree of attachment or degree of freedom dictates whether something is poisonous or nurturing and curing for us. In the same way, as we look at addiction, for example, somebody who comes home from work and has a glass of wine isn't necessarily an addict. They don't need the wine. However, if they go through a tough time and they come home and they find themselves having 3 glasses of wine, we might say, okay, fair enough, bad week. If that person then expands into an experience where they come home and they absolutely need the bottle of wine and they get stressed if they don't have wine in the house, then we know there's an over-attachment to the wine. Now, it's not the wine's fault. It's not the wine that's this nasty, mean, naughty wine. It is our relationship with the thing, with the wine, that makes it either supportive or nurturing or poisonous to us. And in the same way, and following on from that poison or cure idea, effectively, we become the victim or we become the owners based on our relationship with everything. And this is such a fundamentally important idea because it allows us to look inside as well as outside and say, okay, what is it in me that is reacting to this? What is it in me that has an under-attachment, a rejection of attachment, or no attachment to myself, other people, society, family, ideas, things? It's really, really worthwhile to consider this and to check in to just work out how we're doing. So keep that in mind, please. And now that I have explained to you my 3 main principles of acceptance, integration, and alignment, you may well be interested to attend either my NLP practitioner training or my NLP master practitioner training. And if you are interested, please do click the link below to get in touch, and I really look forward to working with you.